notion that society in general should work to transition from using toilet paper to using bidets. There are two main reasons why I think we should do this. The first one is environmental. Your average American uses, I think, around 50 pounds of toilet paper a year. Every pound of that toilet paper, the manufacturing process requires that we cut down trees. It requires that we bleach the paper with various different chemicals. The entire process is very environmentally unfriendly. Toilet paper also can cost the purchaser hundreds of dollars a year, whereas a simple bidet attachment can go for as little as about $80. As far as water, you might at first think that the environmental impact of using more water in the bidet is going to be a big concern, but it doesn't seem like this is actually the case. A bidet can clean you for as little as 1/8 of a gallon of water, whereas a flush of the toilet would use 4 gallons. This is not really comparable, in my opinion, to the devastating environmental impact of having to use toilet paper. And it's actually not even clear that the net result of normalizing bidet use is going to increase the amount of water that we use at all. Because, for example, if you're only flushing waste and not also trying to flush toilet paper, we can actually further reduce the amount of gallons used in each flush. The other reason, primarily, is a sanitary one. Bidets are, on the one hand, known to clean better than toilet paper. Toilet paper can also cause a variety of problems, like it can cause microcuts around the nether regions. It can be uncomfortable and possibly unsanitary, and some people are even allergic to toilet paper. Furthermore, professionals after using the restroom, there are very few people that do this. And because when you use a bidet, you're going to be in less contact directly with fecal matter. The low rates of compliance that we have for hand washing is going to be much less of a problem, which overall will make society healthier and safer. And that concludes my opening statement.
Cool, thanks. So I'll just start off by saying that I don't disagree that bidets use less water. In fact, when I was doing some research on this, I did some calculations. Using toilet paper, the average person will use about 100 rolls in a year. One roll of toilet paper takes about 37 gallons of water to make. That's including the water for the processing and the water for cutting it down. And then that's about 3,700 gallons of water a year. Now, a bidet, every time you flush, it only uses about 1/8 a gallon of water to use a bidet. This is a very conservative estimate. And if we assume a person just uses a bidet once a day, then we get about 45.6 gallons of water in a year for the average person. And so you get savings of 3,654.4 gallons if you use just a bidet versus using toilet paper. Now, that is a lot of water that you're saving, but there's something that hasn't really been brought up, which is the average bidet user will finish their use of the bidet using toilet paper. In countries where bidets are used, after you use the bidet, you take one piece of toilet paper, you wipe your ass because you don't air dry it, you clean it up, so you're touching your butthole anyways. You're using less toilet paper overall, but you're still using toilet paper. So when you add in the toilet paper used, the savings of water go way down. So I still think that using the bidet would probably save you more water than including using that toilet paper, because you use less toilet paper overall. I'm fine granting that you use less water, but I just want to point out that the amount of water used there, even if we use just the, air dry your butthole version of the bidet, which is not the way bidets are used, by the way, but if we assume that perfect case scenario of air drying, then you would save 3,654 gallons of water I don't think that amount of water is good enough reason for the entire society to move to using bidets over toilet paper. I don't think that is a good enough reason. Perhaps we could say it's virtuous for someone to switch to a bidet, but whenever I think of something where we should do something as a moral imperative, which I take this proposition to be about, it's a moral argument here. I don't think that's a good enough reason, and I'll give you an example as to why. So we're not having a debate on everyone should stop drinking coffee. Coffee is widely consumed around the world. Everyone loves it. No one talks about how immoral it is to have a cup of coffee. One cup of coffee will use about 130 liters of water to be made. That's including growing the beans and shipping it and then bringing it all together. 130 liters. Now, if you drink 1 cup of water a day and you convert that to gallons, that's 12,534 gallons of water in a single year. That's a little under 4 times the amount of water that you would be saving by switching to a bidet. So if the reason for moving to bidets over toilet paper is water saving, then likewise, we should stop drinking coffee and a whole other host of commodities that we would take as normal everyday items that doesn't have that same kind of moral imperative. So the good reason standard that we've set up, I think, is a standard we wouldn't apply to our normal moral calculations. And for that reason, we should not move to a bidet. And I just want to comment before I close my opening statements about the sanitation. The way bidets are typically used, you wipe at the end, either with a washcloth, usually in your own home, or with a piece of toilet paper. You're still touching your butthole. So there's still an issue of sanitation and washing your hands. So I don't think that it ends up being a symmetry breaker. I think it applies in both cases. So those are the reasons why I think we shouldn't move to bidets.
Okay, that's nice. So in response to your first point, I would say I don't necessarily think that we have an immediate moral imperative to switch to bidet use. I think that we have practical virtues or we have sort of practical reasons for doing so. I think that that's sufficient to defend the debate proposition that we should switch to bidet use. If you wanted to say that we should also switch away from using coffee, I think most people would probably agree with you. We probably should reduce the amount of coffee that we consume in our society. I actually can't think of a good argument against that.
Well, I think most people would not want to stop using coffee. I mean, we can look at something like veganism, for example, where sentient creatures are literally stabbed to death and people don't care. And that's also one of the biggest environmental impacts on climate change with greenhouse gases is the animal agriculture industry. And people don't care because they like how a steak tastes. And likewise, people like how coffee tastes. And so if the standard is what people would do, I really don't think that they would reject coffee because of water usage here.
Right. I think that there's a difference between saying that something is a moral imperative, which I don't necessarily take a position about either bidet use or reducing coffee consumption being a moral imperative. I think that I think that we should make the transition. I don't necessarily think that we have to make the transition.
What does that should mean, though? And why is it there? Because when I hear a should, I think that's normative in any context.
No, it is normative.
Right, and I take normative things to be moral. Like the reason why we should in this case is because it's the right thing to do. In what sense is it the right thing to do?
It's the right thing to do for the reasons that I explained in my
right, but that's not a standard we would use for like the right thing to do to save water. Well, the right thing is not something we would accept in other parts of our life, like coffee, as the example I brought up. That wouldn't fly. It doesn't fly with animal agriculture. So why in this small edge case of something that's like not even a big deal is the thing that we should move towards?
Yeah, so it might not fly in the sense that it might not be motivating. It might not sufficiently motivate us to actually make the change. And I'll make a prediction that I don't think American society tomorrow, after this debate, is suddenly going to start entirely like reorienting itself around bidet use. I don't think that that will practically happen. Just like how I don't think we're practically all going to turn vegan, and just like how I don't practically think that we're all going to stop doing all these other sort of things like drinking coffee. I think that when I say that we should switch to bidet use, what I mean is that the benefits of doing so are going to outweigh the downsides of doing so. But that doesn't necessarily mean that either people should be forced to. I don't think that police should start arresting people for using toilet paper. I don't think that the manufacture of toilet paper should be banned. I just think that in general, we're going to want our society to move over in the direction of the more environmentally sustainable.
Okay. So I think we can agree, at least in this sense, that the should in this case is not like a ban. It's not some type of totalitarian should. And correct me if I'm wrong there, but I think we agree with that. And we do agree that maybe it's not on par with an obligation like you shouldn't murder, for example. You're not going to go to jail if you buy toilet paper, right? So perhaps there's a middle ground where we still disagree. And that might be around the nature of society here and what obligations we think society should have. Or perhaps obligation is incorrect. Maybe I should say something more like what type of moral virtue society should be reaching towards. And so it seems to me like your position is that it is morally good that we should move away from using toilet paper. And mine is it's not really an issue. There is no should there or not. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Okay, so in the spirit of charitability, I'm fine accepting that would be kind of the threshold here for what the should means. It's more about like individual virtue, but when we talk about society, we're talking about everyone working towards that and adopting it. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so your argument rests on environmental reasons of why we should move towards that. And the environmental reasons, the worst one here being the water usage.
Sure.
And so you likewise agree that things like coffee are problematic.
Yes.
Okay.
I would bite the bullet on. I would bite the bullet that in general our society should be much. Well, it's not really even a bullet. Like it's just true that our society should be much more environmentally conscious.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I agree with you that I think individuals should be working towards reducing their impact in all elements of their life. But when we're talking about society doing something, I'm making a different type of claim where I think we all collectively should have the same should. So it's not just like, everyone should be reducing. It's like everyone should be reducing in a specific way. And with toilet paper and bidets, I feel like the impact is so small versus all of these other things that we do. We're kind of like starting at the wrong place. We should be starting instead at those things that consume way more water. And the bidet thing isn't the place I would start. I would start with animal agriculture or perhaps coffee, even though I love coffee. I mean, coffee uses way more water than toilet paper.
Okay, so to clarify a little bit on the society thing, I don't really know what it would mean to say that every individual should do something, but that society as a whole shouldn't. I also think that in practice, there is at least one case where we have a sort of socially accessible method for reducing toilet paper use with no analogy to some other products, which is that in the construction of new buildings, especially corporate buildings, we have the option right there from the outset of deciding what sort of facilities to install. And that's going to be a decision that's going to have to be made, not necessarily by society, but by people in positions of power in society. And the same is going to apply for the construction of new houses and also for the construction of government buildings.
Well,
Further,
and I think,
American. Oh, sorry. I was going to say one more.
I was
Okay,
just
go
going to
ahead.
add to that. We could also easily retrofit other houses with a bidet that just sits on top of toilets, which costs less than $100. So I think it would be very easy to retrofit. Just to add to your point here, that
Right.
it wouldn't have to just be the buildings. We could also retrofit.
Yeah, and one more point I was going to add is that American society has a problem, not necessarily unique, but much different than a lot of other developed countries where the use of bidets is like actively stigmatized. People have sort of an aversion to it that I think could probably be fixed, if nothing else, just by having like a TV show where the characters use bidets, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we were to move to bidets as a society, having TV shows normalizing it would be a great way to do it. I'm still concerned about the reasons why we would do it. And the reasons being something like environmentalism, it's not motivating for me when there are these way bigger fish to fry in terms of environmentalism. I mean, like water usage is not even the top thing to worry about in environmentalism. Greenhouse gas emissions are.
Right. So when I was making my case, I focused more on the greenhouse gas emissions from the which any paper product is going to have a pretty significant greenhouse gas emission, and also it carries the risk of chemical contamination. And beyond that, there can even be like people can have bad reactions to the chemicals in the toilet paper itself. It's supposed to be biodegradable, but all the same, the more toilet paper we have to treat in the wastewater treatment plants, it's gonna provide a bigger burden for like treating water.
Right, but I mean, we're already going to have to treat that water anyways. And when it comes to production of the paper, usually paper is made out of the scraps from wood that's being used in construction or other things. So making paper is a zero waste product. We're trying to not let all of this sawdust just go there and deteriorate and then release the carbon into the air anyways. So instead, we're trying to take that and put it into some product we can use, and you can recycle toilet paper. It gets recycled over and over again. And recycled paper has a much lower impact than virgin tissue. It's the virgin tissue that would be the real problem, but we can easily move to recycled toilet paper. So I don't think that the greenhouse gas emissions problem is unsolvable, and we're already moving to recycled paper that also falls apart more easily, is more biodegradable, uses less resources, and the water that's used to make the recycled paper is wastewater anyways. It's not the clean water. It's not the water you use to drink. It's water from sewage that's already been treated. So it's part of this like waste nothing production capacity in the United States, at least, where we take the stuff we wouldn't use otherwise, we use it for something else that would be productive and useful that everyone uses. And it also isn't the biggest contributor in terms of greenhouse gases or things like that. It just doesn't seem to me like the we should really be fighting for. There are so many other bigger things. And the only reason why I think we should do any should is if we have good reason. I just don't see the good reason here.
Right. I might be inclined to agree with that argument if I thought that transitioning to bidet use was going to be some kind of like a colossal like Manhattan Project type undertaking that was going to take away our energies from other things. But I just don't think that's the case. I think that on the one hand, trying to normalize bidet usage, that doesn't really cost us anything at all. Not that I can see.
Yeah, we can agree there.
On the other hand,
it'd probably be a funny meme and make money.
Yeah, most likely. Beyond that, I think that the cost for either retrofitting or for just constructing new buildings or whatever, it just doesn't seem particularly significant. It doesn't seem like we're going to have to fight against some kind of like massive. Well, I guess we would have to fight against the toilet paper lobby, but whatever. Whereas other products, like people are actually going to fight pretty hard to keep their meat, their coffee, other things like that.
Okay, so maybe there's a place we would disagree, and this is sort of getting into the psychology of the toilet paper user, because bidets aren't really unknown to Americans, for example, especially those who like travel to Europe, and they're like really off put by it, even when they try it, and they don't really see the benefit of using the bidet because they have to use the toilet paper at the end anyways to dry the ass. So it's like a lot more effort on the user's part, and they still use toilet paper at the end of the day. So we're not really cutting out the toilet paper issue from the equation entirely.
Yeah,
so we need to come up with a solution for drying the ass.
Right. Well, so there are very few cases when we talk about environmental impact that we cut things out entirely. I don't really think it's on the table to entirely remove our use of toilet paper. But
okay, I take your point there.
But I'm generally talking about like quantitative benefits from reducing the usage, which I think are pretty substantial. They might not be substantial, and like I was saying, I don't actually think that we are going to see this huge push. But I think all the same, it would be a good thing if it did happen. And it's something that we should try to promote to the extent that we happen to have the ability.
Sure. Well, you and I both agree it would be virtuous. And I think maybe one of the differences, sort of going back to what I talked about earlier, is what we mean by should here. And it seems like what I take to be it would be virtuous, you take to be that means we should do it. But I don't think that something that would be beneficial is something we should do. Because there are many things I could think of that are virtuous, but I wouldn't necessarily put that in the category of I should do this.
Okay. Well, so would you also extend that to, let's say we have something else that's relatively low impact? Like we could have using more efficient light bulbs. We could even have using lower water pressure when you, just in general.
Well, okay, so I'm a bit more, when we're talking about these commodities and things like that, I don't think that should is part of the equation, in the sense that I think it's more about some kind of financial incentive, some type of like market mechanism. So to go sort of capitalist about it, I think the greener light bulbs will save you money and last longer. And that's the reason why they're chosen, not because of some type of should that motivates someone to purchase that light bulb. And then when people say like, oh, well, it saves energy, I think that's usually just a way someone pats themselves on the back and says like, I did a good job. And likewise with the bidet, I think that is sort of what would happen, where maybe there would be some type of like capitalistic incentive, which would push us to using bidets, and then people would sort of retroactively say like, I'm doing a morally good thing. But when I say something, we should do something, for me, it's not about like, finding this more efficient commodity. It's about some type of virtue or moral imperative that I'm applying in my life that's a motivator for my action. And I just don't see switching to a bidet being in that category for motivating my action.
Okay. So do you think in general that we can't have non-motivating shoulds?
It depends on what you mean by non-motivating here.
Yeah, well, so all I mean is that we have some should, we have something that you ought do, but that the ought, whatever it is, isn't actually altering your actions. It doesn't actually motivate the action.
I mean, it's hard to say, because again, I think there's sort of some grayness around motivate there. But like perhaps we can talk about language, because that's something that is not necessarily considered moral, but it is something that's normative. Like when we use the same word, if I want you to understand what I'm saying, I ought use the word in a way you'll understand. Like chair, that has meaning if I point to a chair and you accept it as a chair, that kind of thing. Like I take that to be a type of should that occurs. Now, I wouldn't say that I am conscious of the motivator there, of that normative motivator, but I would say that it's at play. It's a type of rule in the game that's occurring. When we're talking about the bidet and toilet paper thing, what's specifically at play is a change of rules where we go from one norm to another. So perhaps there are some shoulds that aren't motivating, but it's not, I don't think, impacting this type of should, which is one of transformation. We go from one thing to another. And I take that rule change, that change of the game, should only occur if there's a type of like obligation in some sense, or good reason perhaps to do it.
Yeah, well, so the going from one rule to another, if it takes place, is only going to take place at the behest of people who have some amount of like social influence, right? And so I might say that even if in the case of an individual making decisions to like get a bidet attachment or whatever, it's not going to rise to the level of what you would consider a should. It might still rise to that level when we're talking about decisions made by people. They can have a much larger effect. Like if I'm a property manager and I make the decision to start, well, I can make all sorts of decisions for environmental sustainability that an individual owning their house probably wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
And the same is going to apply for people who are leaders in the cultural sphere or who are government officials.
Yeah, I guess whenever I'm thinking of society, I think if I'm asking society to do something, I think there's some type of moral claim there. But like if I'm a landlord, say, and I want to save money on the water bill, or I want to have an environmental impact or something and reduce toilet paper because I believe it's worse, and I make all my tenants not use toilet paper, that's not a situation of me expecting them to make that moral claim or moral action. That's me just making the decision for them.
Well, what the point is that there's someone, whether it's a landlord or whether it's somebody else who's making the decision. We would say for the person making the decision that it's of some moral consequence.
Sure. In this proposition, when we talk about society, I think there are sort of two routes where that should could be obtained. One would be this decentralized should, where everyone kind of hops on with consensus, like, moral blockchain, for example. The other is a centralized should, where there's like the server in the middle that says, this is what we're going to do. And we both agreed the centralized server in the middle is not the one we're talking about. So we would be talking more about blockchain, which would be a consensus. And so with the should on society, what I'm saying is the consensus ought to be not using the bidet. But I don't think we have good reason to say that. I mean, sorry, the consensus claim would be we ought not use toilet paper. And I don't think that should be the claim made here. I don't think that's necessary or that we even have good reason.
Okay. So just so we're clear, the way that I'm interpreting what we should do, or the state of society that I'm talking about as what we should want to obtain, would just be something similar to the way things work in countries like Japan or countries like France. I'm not necessarily saying that like people are going to hate you if you admit that you like toilet paper or whatever. I'm just saying that in general, just like we already have in a lot of other countries around the world, we should normalize and promote the usage of the more environmentally friendly option.
But I take those to be different propositions. I think there's a proposition of we should normalize X action versus we should move to X action. I take those to be two different propositions.
Well, I mean, in this case, so I'm saying we should do X action. Mm-hmm. X action is a change in the way society operates. I'm just saying the end goal there is not going to be a society where we stigmatize somebody, not using a bidet. The end goal of a society is just one where that is the sort of where that's the ordinary thing to do, and where that's what most people do.
Okay, that kind of sounds like it's the same claim, like saying we should do X action, and then saying eventually the ideal would be to get to where everyone's doing X action. I just sort of think they're kind of referring to the same outcome eventually. But what I'm concerned about is when we say someone should do X action, or when we say society should do X action, we're typically invoking some type of reason for it. The reasons for switching to a bidet over toilet paper are so small, I don't think they're really worth it, to the point where I would categorize it as a should, as some type of motivating action. And we can remove the word moral here, and we can talk about it without moral language, although I think that's quite difficult with the word should. But even if we didn't consider it moral, we're talking about the should, there needs to be good reason. The good reason in this case, as we went through, was more like, okay, well, the one clear thing outstanding is that the water usage is worse. And there are so many other things that have worse water usage. So if that's the standard of should for our society, we're moving into a type of asceticism that no one would accept. And I think society requires some type of consensus or some type of force. We also agreed that there's no force that we're applying here, so we're relying on consensus. And I don't think this is the kind of should that would be obtained or motivated. And for that reason, I don't think we should move to bidets over toilet paper.
All right. So one pretty noticeable difference between the bidet situation and a lot of the other ones is that we already have models of societies that are doing what I'm proposing. I think right now, Americans we're about 4% of the population, and we use, I think, over 20% of toilet paper in the world. Like we overconsume it to a pretty high extent. I think that there is a model for other societies that are less wasteful than we are. And I think we should, not necessarily to the point that it takes priority over other issues, but I think that we should work to rectify that situation. And I think that that's, maybe not to you, but to me, that does rise to the level of what I would call a should.
But so are you likewise going to not eat almonds? Almonds
I don't think
use more water than toilet paper.
Right. I can.
Are you likewise not going to eat alfalfa? Are you not going to eat soybeans?
I didn't say that I was going.
The point here being like, okay, so let's say we reduce the things we eat because of greenhouse gas emissions. What we're left with is plant-based foods, which still use a lot of water. Okay, so then the water usage for those plant-based foods to replace the calories for the animal agriculture is still going to be more water than the toilet paper. So even on a plant-based diet, you're going to be using a lot more water anyways to get the calories you need and the nutrients you need. And if the standard for why we should do X is because this much water is being used, then we've gotten ourselves to the point of we can't even eat now. And so the good reasons for doing something as motivating this proposition fail when we look at other propositions that we take as shoulds that we need to adopt going forward. Like we should be going more plant-based for the environment. Okay. We should be reducing our water. Okay. Well, now we're in a dilemma. And I don't think that the amount of water used here for the toilet paper merits putting in this type of should that we're going for. At best, it's like, okay, it's in the category of you should take the shopping cart and bring it back to where you got it from. But that's not a should that we would like fight or die over or anything like that. It's just like, okay, that's a nice courteous thing to do. It's the type of should that we would maybe put on courtesy rather than the type of should that we would put down for like practical reason.
Sure. I think one sort of important difference between the bidet thing and other examples is that most of the time when we talk about what people should do, we're also going to take into account the cost to the person who's performing the action. In the case of, I think earlier you were talking about us not being able to eat because it uses too much water. Well, obviously that's going to be a pretty big deal for our society. But in the case of the bidet switch, as far as I can tell, you're actually going to be saving yourself money. And well, in fact, it just seems like you're benefiting yourself and you're also benefiting the environment. Whereas even with other things that we might take to be wasteful, like coffee. Well, I enjoy drinking coffee. I don't necessarily enjoy using toilet paper. It doesn't seem like...
I enjoy using toilet paper way more than not using toilet paper.
Sure. Well, if you feel like your quality of life would be very negatively affected by switching over to a bidet, then I might not necessarily say that you should do it. I just don't think that that's true for the vast majority of people. And I think the vast majority of people, even who aren't accustomed to it, are going to be able to acclimate themselves to that, just like how we can acclimate ourselves to almost anything.
Right, but maybe we should move to closing statements in a second. But I think like for the shoulds that we're talking about here, again, we're not disagreeing that the consequences might be favorable in some way. But when we're saying we should do something, that's a little bit more motivating than saying this would be favorable. This is favorable and we ought to move to that favorable consequence. And we do that because of good reason. And, we looked at the symmetry breakers of why there's a good reason to go to a bidet versus toilet paper. And that threshold is so low, it would lead us into an aesthetic lifestyle no one would accept. In fact, I think you could make an argument that someone should move to being carnivore because they poop a lot less, so you use a lot less toilet paper. And they wouldn't be using plant-based products because they wouldn't be using a bunch of water. And you could maybe say like, well, why don't they just go kill a whale? And then the whale could feed 100 people for a year. And now you're only killing one sentient being rather than, millions of sentient beings from the poison and pesticide. So now we've come to this threshold of like, let's not use water, let's lower all of the greenhouse gas emissions we're doing, and let's just eat whales. And we'll poop less, we'll get all our nutrients from meat, and now what kind of a lifestyle do we have? In this whole like pot of shoulds that we have in our life, of things we should do, the threshold that we've come to with toilet paper and a bidet is like so minute that I think at best we could say it might be, in an ideal world, it might be good. But when we say should, we're not saying it's in an ideal world. We're saying let's move towards it. And I don't think we have good reason to move towards it here. And if we do grant that those are good reasons to move towards it, then we're left in this hilarious reductio of a world where we're either carnivores eating whales or we're like starving ourselves like a Jane might. And perhaps I'll leave that as my closing statements and just say that we should not move to toilet paper over a bidet. Or
okay.
Sorry, we should not move to a bidet over toilet paper.
Okay, well, so since Arco just conceded, I'm not going to do that. So one difficulty, I think, with the argument that you're trying to make about how the general principle of the general principle that would lead us to switching to bidets over toilet paper would eventually lead to some sort of like overly Spartan lifestyle or reduce our quality of life in other ways, is that for us to make a multitude of changes that that eventually reduced our quality of life, it would have to be the case that we're making some of those changes would have to actually individually reduce our quality of life, right? Like I can't have a multitude of little environmental changes that all help me, but that taken together hurt me. And given that I don't think that bidet use has any negative effects on the person, barring some kind of, like, I don't even know what would cause that. Given that I don't think that using bidets actually hurts you, I don't think that we can say that there's some kind of reductio from should use a bidet to should harm yourself in some way. And so for that reason, I think a lot of the arguments you're making are not going to